Freddie, why should the neighboring states pay for what Israel and the United States did in Gaza?
Because as a realist, you should accept that it's in their regional interest.
It's not in their regional interest at all.
Why not?
The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. I mean, Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable, and they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this?
Hello and welcome to the Americano show. Today I am delighted to be joined by a favourite guest of our show, and that's Professor John Mearsheimer, who is a professor and international relations scholar at the University of Chicago. And we're going to be asking if Donald Trump's foreign policy makes any sense. Because, as you will have noticed, over the last 3 weeks, there has been a blizzard of foreign policy news coming out of the White House, major developments, seemingly major developments, so much so that it's been quite hard to concentrate on what is going on for journalists, let alone people who aren't paid to follow this for a living. John, I'll start by asking you, what are your sort of broad brush impressions of Trump's foreign policy in his second term? Has it differed in any way to what you expected?
I think that basically what Trump is trying to do at this point in time is to sort of create chaos on all fronts, make a number of wild assertions, put forward policy ideas that are never going to be realized. And I think the hope on his part is that out of all this chaos that he's creating, he can come up with some sort of formidable grand strategy that solves all the big problems that the United States and the West faces, and in the end, fashion a coherent grand strategy that deals with these different problems. But at this point in time, what we really have is him making a lot of, I think it's fair to say, wild and crazy statements. I mean, the idea that Canada is going to become the 51st state, that we're going to take back the Panama Canal, that we're going to grab Greenland, that the United States is going to go into Gaza and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Well, all these ideas are basically outlandish. And you would not expect, a new president to start off by making a whole set of comments like that. And at the same time, and we can talk more about this, I don't think he's done much of anything to fix the Middle East problem. And this is mainly the Gaza problem at this point in time, or the Ukraine problem. You want to remember, he said that he was going to come in and solve the Ukraine problem in one day, and that maybe even solve it before he moved into the White House. We can talk about this again, but if anything, it looks to me like we're in more trouble on Ukraine than we were before he became the president. So I'm not too sure how this all works out in the end. He may have a grand strategy in mind that escapes me, and we may live happily ever after. But at this point in time, it sure doesn't look that way.
Can I try and put a small point in Trump's defense? When you say he's proposing ethnically cleansing Palestinians, has he actually done that?
Has he done that?
Yeah.
No, and he's not going to be able to do it. That's my point.
No, but has he proposed that?
Yes, he's talked about pushing the Palestinians, all of the Palestinians. By my count, there were, before this conflict started on October 7th, there were about 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. And he's talking about clearing them all out. And that would have to be done at the end of a rifle barrel. Those people are not going to leave. He has not said that he was going to push them out at the end of a rifle barrel, but that is implicit in what he says. But he's committed to getting rid of those people, and he's now said that they're not welcome back. In the beginning, when he first raised this idea, he talked about pushing them out maybe temporarily. But now that's been taken off the table, and the idea is that they're going to be pushed out permanently. And he's going to find new homes for them in places like Jordan and Egypt.
Well, I want to get onto Gaza a bit more later, but if we could stick for now with the broad brush points. Um, you're a realist. You are probably the world's leading expert on realism in international relations. Does it not strike you that perhaps Trump is a much more realist foreign policy president than his predecessors? He is asserting or trying to assert control over the Western Hemisphere in a more direct and open way than others. And he is transactional and pragmatic in his approach to Ukraine and the Middle East. His tariffs are direct and strike me as faintly realistic in some ways. Certainly not in terms of the economics, but in terms of the hard power dynamics. What do you make of what I'm saying?
I think there's no question, Freddie, that he definitely has realist instincts. You want to remember that when he became president in 2017, he immediately abandoned engagement with China and switched to a containment policy. And indeed, he campaigned on abandoning engagement and moving toward containment in 2016. And I believe that's a very realist policy. He's also made the argument that all these terrible forever wars should have never happened, and that he was going to end them, and that he was not going to engage in any more forever wars. Given those policy positions, I applaud him. I think he was on the money. But what we're talking about now is how he is acting since he moved into the White House on January 20th. What exactly is his grand strategy? And I think that at this point in time, it looks like it's hard to say exactly how he's going to pursue those broad realist goals. And I think, if anything, it looks remarkably chaotic. If you made me president of the United States, we don't have to worry about that ever happening. I would not have come into office and started talking about, annexing Canada, taking back the Panama Canal, and so forth and so on. I would have put all my attention on trying to shut down the Gaza conflict once and for all, and also trying to shut down the Ukraine conflict once and for all. Those should be the highest priority issues. And I don't think that he has paid much attention to Ukraine. And with regard to Gaza, I think that his proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East is really crazy, and is not going to help the situation. So he may have realist instincts. This is your point. And he may be a marked improvement on his predecessor and his predecessors in this regard. I'm not going to argue against that. But in terms of how he's actually performed in the first 3 weeks, and we do want to be aware of the fact that he's only been president for 3 weeks, and that's a very short period of time. So you don't want to pass final judgment. But I would just say, I don't think he's off to a good start.
How much weight do you put on rhetoric or words or messaging when you study things from a realist point of view? I mean, could you not say that what Trump says is less important than what America actually does? And of course, rhetoric and bluster is clearly part of his modus operandi.
Well, I think there's no question that a lot of what he says, everybody recognizes it doesn't mean very much in and of itself. In other words, no, I don't think anybody believes Canada is going to become the 51st state, or that we're going to invade Panama anytime soon. So I think there's no question that people understand that a lot of this is just bluster. It's the way Trump operates, and he does it at the domestic level as well as the foreign policy level. But the point I would make to you, Freddie, is I do think words matter. And I think if you look at all the different things that he's been saying to different audiences, It's not clear that this is very helpful. And we don't want to get into the Ukraine case in great detail at this point in time. But if you look at Ukraine, he said a number of things to the Russians that are quite offensive and are not going to engender trust in him among Russian elites, especially Putin. And I think moving forward, if anything, he wants to do everything he can to create a situation where Trump is trusted by Putin. But if you look at what he says and how he says it, I don't think he's, helping his cause. Trump is helping his cause. So words do matter, even for realists. And I think in that regard, he's not been terribly smart.
Do you think that the Israelis have a point when they say that Trump is thinking out of the box? This is what Netanyahu says, and that is constructive, because there are no other viable solutions for what to do about Gaza. And when it comes to the Palestinians, attempts to accommodate them, attempts to find some kind of compromise have always failed, going back to 1948.
You're asking me, is there a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been there and we've just missed? The answer is no. There was no way you were going to solve this one because the Israelis from the beginning have wanted all of Greater Israel. They were never interested in giving the Palestinians a state of their own. This is a myth that we purvey in the West so that we can support Israel fully. So it's not like I think there is a solution out there, a viable solution. The best that the Israelis were able to come up with was where they basically locked the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant open air prison, and they thought they could manage that problem. And that looked like it worked up until October 7th. And now the question is, what do you do moving forward? And the Israelis would like to cleanse Gaza. That's been their policy goal since October 7th, to cleanse Gaza. They want to get rid of all the Palestinians. And the question is, do you think this is a viable or an ethical solution? I don't think it's a viable solution because I don't think the Palestinians are going to leave. You want to remember that the Israelis have just spent the past 16 months executing what I call a genocide in Gaza. They have murdered huge numbers of Palestinians. By almost all accounts, they've made the place unlivable. It's really quite remarkable when you see the destruction that they have wrought in Gaza. And nevertheless, the Palestinians are still there, and Hamas, by Israeli accounts and by Tony Blinken's account, is alive and well. So what are we going to do now to fix the problem? What's the viable solution that Trump has? What is this thinking outside of the box add up to? There's no question he's thinking outside of the box, but is what he is thinking logical? Is it viable? Is it morally correct? I don't think it's any of those things. I, as an American, certainly don't want to be associated with a policy that calls for ethnically cleansing Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. And furthermore, I don't think you can do it. The Israelis were unable to do it. I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Trump has made it clear we're not going to go in there and do it. So who's going to do it? The Israelis? Well, they've already tried. What do you think they've been doing for the past 15 months? This is like, people say, if the hostages don't come back on Saturday, these are the Israeli hostages who are due to be released this Saturday. If they don't come back, Netanyahu is going to restart the war. And I say to myself, okay, what does that mean? The war was not going very well, which is why the Israelis agreed to the ceasefire. They didn't agree to the ceasefire because Trump put great pressure on them. They agreed to the ceasefire in large part because the IDF, the Israeli military, put great pressure on Netanyahu to effect a ceasefire because the IDF understood it could not defeat Hamas, number one, and number two, the Israeli army was coming apart at the seams. It was suffering great casualties in Gaza, and furthermore, that this is an army that's configured for fighting short wars, not long wars. It was not configured to fight a war of attrition over a long period of time in Gaza. So it was in deep trouble. So the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. And now we're talking about putting an end to that ceasefire. Okay, what's the magic formula that the Israelis have now come up with that's going to allow them to deal with the Hamas problem that they couldn't deal with for the first 16 months of the war? I just don't understand. Trump is thinking outside the box, but sometimes thinking outside the box makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, I don't think it makes sense.
I want to go back a little bit to where you said that the Israelis have always wanted a greater Israel. Isn't that a pretty controversial thing to say and perhaps unfair, given that there may be politicians in Israel today who wanted greater Israel and have done for a long time, but Israel as a state has not always acted as though it has wanted a greater Israel. It has sought accommodation with the Palestinians and it has been rebuffed.
No, I don't believe that. I believe these are myths that we tell ourselves in the West so that we can continue to support Israel down the line. I think the original Zionists, the people who were interested in creating a Jewish state, which of course happened in May of 1948, understood full well that they could not take all the territory at once, simply because there were so many Palestinians in the area and not nearly as many Jews, and it would have to be done incrementally. But the idea that the Israelis were interested in a meaningful two-state solution, and it was the Palestinians who rejected those wholly generous offers by the Israelis, is a tall tale. And I know we tell it in the West, and when I make the argument that I'm making, people think that, I'm an anti-Semite or I'm hostile to Israel and so forth and so on. But there's a whole literature written by Israelis that makes it clear that the Israelis were never interested in creating a Palestinian state, and they wanted all of Israel. They just understood that they'd have to do it gradually. They wouldn't be able to take all that territory all at once.
Yeah, well, I would never accuse you of anti-Semitism, although I know a lot of people do. But let's get back to Trump rather than getting into a discussion of Middle Eastern politics, because what a lot of people are speculating, and this certainly looks like it might be playing out now, is that what Trump was trying to do was pressure the neighboring Arab states to come up with viable solutions of their own, possibly rebuilding Gaza themselves, paying for it, and possibly trying to take care, look after some of the Palestinian people who have been displaced. Jordan seems to be rebuffing Trump a bit more forcefully at the moment, whereas Egypt has suggested that it would like to come up with a reconstruction plan for Gaza. So perhaps this is bluster from Trump that is working, that's achieving leverage over those Arab states.
I don't believe that at all. It's actually united the Arab states in the region. There's universal agreement among the Arab states and universal agreement in the Arab and Islamic world that this is morally reprehensible, that this is the Palestinians' land, that the United States and Israel have absolutely no right to push them out. And in no way are they going to accommodate the United States and Israel. We're isolated on this one. I'm sure the Europeans are with us on this for the most part. But outside of the Europeans, there's no support for what the United States wants to do in this case. The last thing Jordan wants is to create a huge enclave for more Palestinians inside its borders. And Egypt is thinking the same way. Look, the fact is the United States is remarkably powerful. And it has tremendous leverage over Egypt and Jordan, because in the past, we worked out a deal with Egypt and Jordan where we would give them huge amounts of financial aid if they played nice with Israel. We bought off for Israel. We did this for Israel. We bought off Jordan and Egypt. Again, there's a huge literature on this. This is not something I'm making up. But once we do that, not only do we guarantee at the time that Egypt and Jordan will play nice with Israel, but it gives us huge leverage over time. And Trump fully understands that. And he's basically telling the Jordanians and the Egyptians, we have huge economic leverage over you. And we're going to use that leverage to force you, we're going to coerce you into accepting the Palestinians. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not the Jordanians and the Egyptians will cave. And the Jordanians made it clear yesterday. The Jordanian president made it clear in a tweet after his meeting with Trump that that's not going to happen. And Sisi, the General Sisi, the Egyptian leader, canceled his trip to Washington because he doesn't want to be humiliated by Trump. And he wants to make it clear that he's not going to go along either. So you have a situation here, Freddie. The Palestinians are not going to leave. The Egyptians are not going to take them. The Jordanians are not going to take them. And then you have to ask yourself a simple question. Where does that leave us?
Well, I would say, I'd go back to that point that the Egyptians are saying that they're going to propose a redevelopment plan for Gaza. And to some extent, Trump's move has exposed a certain hypocrisy among the Arab states, which is that there is an astronomical bill to fix Gaza, which neighboring states are not willing to pay. And yet they are willing to condemn Israel, to condemn the United States. They're not willing to take part in any solutions. Trump is pushing them into coming up with solutions.
Freddie, why should the neighboring states pay for what Israel and the United States did in Gaza?
Because as a realist, you should accept that it's in their regional interest.
It's not in their regional interest at all.
Why not?
The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable. And they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this? And the answer is the Israelis, Benjamin Netanyahu sitting right next to Trump. And Netanyahu did it in cahoots with Joe Biden and the West, and especially the United States. We should pay for rebuilding Gaza. The Israelis should pay for rebuilding Gaza. It's the Israelis and the Americans who destroyed Gaza, not the Egyptians or the Jordanians.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, speaking of the United States paying for rebuilding Gaza, that is what Trump is proposing. So if we take his proposal at face value, a lot of people who support Trump, or a lot of people who voted for Trump, I'd say, did not imagine that occupying Gaza, which is what he's proposing, he said it repeatedly now, would be part of the foreign policy agenda. And in fact, it goes against what he's appeared to stand for, and appeared to stand for in both elections, in all three elections, presidential elections that he's fought, which is America first, not getting entangled in the Middle East, or further entangled in the Middle East. This would be a huge entanglement, would it not?
Yeah, I've seen a number of tweets from people who identify with the MAGA agenda, protesting what Trump is doing, saying, what is he doing here? My response to that is Trump's proposal on Gaza is not a serious proposal. The United States is not going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. This is about as likely as Canada becoming the 51st state. Trump likes to bluster. He likes to make all of these outrageous statements, and then everybody pays huge amounts of attention to these statements, and they never add up to much. You remember when he fell in love with the North Koreans, and he was going to solve that problem, get rid of North Korean nuclear weapons. How well did that work out? The answer is not very well at all. And this one's not going to work out very well either. This is a giant problem. And by the way, Freddie, Trump played an important role in fashioning the ceasefire that took place on January 19th. This is the Gaza ceasefire that took place on January 19th, which, of course, is the day before he moved into the White House. He sent his mediator, his Middle East mediator, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East to basically tell Netanyahu, let's get a ceasefire. So it looked like Trump was off to a good start, right? We got a ceasefire in Gaza. And most people, not Netanyahu and company, but most people thought that was all for the good. But since he moved into the White House on January 20th, he's cut in the other direction. And if anything, he's done all he can to undermine the ceasefire agreement. And in my opinion, that doesn't make sense from his point of view, because a ceasefire and trying to work out some sort of meaningful modus vivendi with Israel and the Palestinians is a much smarter thing to do than try to turn Gaza into the Riviera in the Middle East.
Do you think, though, it does make sense from Trump's point of view that perhaps he knew that he had angered the Israelis, he'd angered Netanyahu, and that even perhaps beforehand he'd agreed with Netanyahu that he would change his position later? He angered them in the ceasefire, and he changed his position later to be more accommodating to Israel once he was in power, having achieved this ceasefire on the eve of his inauguration.
Yeah, I think that's a very smart observation, and I think you're probably right. But is there any hard evidence to support it? No, we don't know. And as you know, Trump is somebody who says one thing 1 minute and then says the exact opposite a minute later. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. I mean, as I said at the top of the show, I do think that Trump is into sowing chaos, and he operates on the assumption that if you sow chaos, that this will help him, to develop a solution to the various problems, or develop solutions to the various problems that the United States faces around the world. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe he's just bent on, saying different things on different days. I would note, though, Freddie, just very quickly, that to contradict myself, at first it looked like when he was talking about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, that he was just posturing and this was not serious. But it now looks like he really believes that he thinks that this is a meaningful policy position to hold, and that he, for the time being, is going to stick to it. I don't know how long he'll stick to it, because it ought to be quite apparent to him that he's not getting a lot of support in the Arab world, and that Hamas is not going to give up easily in Gaza, and he's going to have to force them out, the Palestinians, if he wants to put this grand plan of his into operation.
Isn't the real politique, if I can say that, here all about Iran, and that Witkoff, Trump, and Netanyahu, they are aligned to an extent on what they want to do about Iran, and that just an hour before Trump's press office released a statement about the plan to take over Gaza, they released the agreement that Netanyahu and Trump seem to have reached on applying maximum pressure on Iran, on effectively pushing the Iranian regime as hard as they can.
No, I disagree with that. In fact, Haaretz had a headline story yesterday that made the point that what happened in Netanyahu's visit to the United States with regard to the Iranian issue was terrible news for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not interested in maximum pressure. We've tried maximum pressure before. You want to remember that President Trump, in his first term, walked away from the nuclear arms agreement that the West and the Russians and the Chinese had fashioned with Iran. This is the famous JCPOA. That was the nuclear agreement. In 2018, Trump walked away from that, and Trump said that we're going to instead pursue a policy of maximum pressure to force Iran to agree to a better deal. Well, that failed. And what he's doing now is he is telling the Israelis, he's telling Netanyahu something he doesn't want to hear, which is that the United States is not planning on using military force to attack Iran. That's what Netanyahu wants. He wants the United States and Israel operating as a tag team to go in and blast the nuclear facilities in Iran. Trump has made it clear he has no interest in doing that, and instead he's going back to maximum pressure. The Israelis, of course, had to agree in public with Trump's policy position, but behind closed doors, they're adamantly opposed to it, which is why Haaretz had this headline yesterday saying that Netanyahu's position on Iran was undermined during his visit to Washington.
I take that point, but I suppose what I was getting at was the first Trump administration made some strides. It wasn't all just bluster and bluff in the Middle East. They did make some strides towards achieving the Abraham Accords, better negotiations between Arab states and Israel. And of course, the final piece of that puzzle, not the final piece, but a very important piece of that puzzle, will be an accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that by applying maximum pressure on Iran, perhaps not going as far as Netanyahu wants, but they are pushing ahead with the process that they started in their first term.
I'm not sure what you're saying here. First of all, with regard to Iran, Iran is now enriching uranium up to 60% as a result of walking away from the JCPOA, as a result of Trump's policy, which was enthusiastically backed by Benjamin Netanyahu. We're now in a situation where Iran is about 2 weeks away from where it could enrich enough uranium for 4 or 5 bombs. 2 weeks away. To go from 60% enrichment to 90% enrichment is easy. That is saying that we are in much worse shape today with regard to a nuclear Iran than we were in 2018 when Trump walked away from the JCPOA. With regard to the Abraham Accords, I don't think the Abraham Accords matter for very much anyway. So there are these 4 Abraham Accords. What do they have to do with solving the Palestinian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Hezbollah problem? What do they have to do with solving the Syrian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Iranian problem? The answer is virtually nothing. So you have good relations between the UAE and Israel. You have good relations between Sudan and Morocco and Israel. Does this really matter? Were those countries at war and all of a sudden those wars were shut down by the Abraham Accords? I think not. And with regard to Saudi Arabia, if you read what the Saudis are now saying about Trump's plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, it's quite clear that we're further than ever from having an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. Now, in the West, people like to talk about the fact that an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia is just around the corner. I would argue that if you look carefully at the evidence, that's not true at all. But even if you get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, what's the big deal? Is that going to help with all these different problems in places like Gaza, the West Bank, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran? I think the answer is no.
Well, you said earlier that words matter. I would have thought accords matter, and diplomatic relations between countries being good matters because it's better than being bad.
The question, Freddie, is how much does it matter? And the answer is it doesn't matter very much at all. It matters for Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Saudi Arabia is not the big problem in the Middle East. We don't talk about the Saudi versus Israel conflict, right? Or the Sudan versus Israel conflict. We talk about places like Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. And these accords have little to do with those conflicts.
As we understand it, President Trump is quite concerned, or the people around him are quite concerned about an apparent Iranian threat to assassinate him. He said the other day that he's left instructions that if he is assassinated by Iran, there will be all hell to pay, or words to that effect. I mean, I think Trump might be more willing to nuke Tehran than you're willing to grant.
Well, he has made it very clear that he does not want to, quote him, bomb the hell out of Iran. You want to remember that he was elected in 2016 and he was elected again in 2024 on the platform that he was not going to start any more wars. That's the realist in Trump. And I think that's all for the good. I think there's no question if it was clear that Iran assassinated President Trump. And let's hope that never happens. Let's hope he's never assassinated, period. But if there was clear evidence that Iran assassinated Trump as president, there's no question whether Trump left orders or not that his successor would make Iran pay a god-awful price. There's just no question about that. But there's no evidence that Iran is trying to assassinate Trump that I know of. If there's evidence, they can show it to me, and then I'll believe it. But I don't think that Iran would be crazy enough to assassinate Trump. They surely can figure out what the consequences would be for them, and they would not be good. And therefore, I don't think they're out to assassinate Trump. So I think this is much to do about nothing.
There are some people who think, contrary to what I've been saying before, that Trump's agenda is to actually, go to Tehran at some point to surprise everyone by fashioning some kind of agreement with Iran, as he did with Kim Jong-un and North Korea in his first term, and perhaps as Nixon did with China. He sees himself as somebody who's capable of breaking these surprising alliances.
Well, the problem that he would face if he did that, Freddie, is he'd run into the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is deeply committed to making sure that the United States and Iran remain mortal enemies, at least as long as Iran has the capability to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And therefore, I think if Trump began to play nice with Iran, the Israel lobby would move in and make it very clear to him that that's unacceptable, and he would change his behavior.
For viewers who have not read your work on the Israel lobby, what exactly is the Israel lobby?
Well, it's a group of individuals and organizations in the United States that are profoundly committed to making sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. It's very important to understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States and Israel, despite the fact they sometimes have different interests, this is not to deny that they sometimes have the same interest, but they often have different interests. And in those cases, the lobby works overtime to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. And that's what the special relationship is all about. And the lobby is, I believe, the most powerful lobby or interest group in the history of the United States. And it wields enormous influence. And if any president pursues a policy in the Middle East that the Israelis adamantly oppose, you can rest assured that the lobby will go to work on Israel's behalf and push that American leader to support Israel. So on the Iran issue, Bill Clinton, when he was president, he started to play nice with the Israelis. And the lobby quickly moved in and told him the basic facts of life, which is he's not allowed to play nice with the Iranians because the Israeli government considers that unacceptable. I laid this out, Steve Walton, I laid this out in our chapter on Iran in the book on the Israel lobby.
Mm. Well, let's talk about whether there's a Ukraine lobby in Washington and what they might be thinking about Trump's latest moves Scott Bessent is, I think, in Kiev at the moment, talking to Ukraine. There seems to be some kind of deal on the cards, which is that the US, in return for continuing to support Ukraine, will get more obvious access to Ukrainian minerals. And I wonder what you think about that, because to some extent that's a bit like what we were talking about early on, which is that Trump's much more transactional, much more nakedly selfish, if you like, or certainly national interest driven foreign policy is at least more direct and clear than the Biden administration's policy, which was to sort of sotto voce talk about Ukraine's minerals and how important they could be, but publicly to talk about democracy and the importance of defending it and so on.
Look, if you're a good realist, Freddie, you defend a country like Ukraine because you think it's in the American national interest. And basically, what Trump is saying is that if you don't pay us back for what he claims is the $300 billion that we've given you to fight this war, if you don't pay us back with this mineral wealth, we're going to cut off our assistance to you. This is what you call transactional. This is completely at odds with basic realist logic. I mean, it looks like we're in this to make money. And it's no accident that the German chancellor condemned Trump for making this claim or making this line of argument. It makes us look like we're mercenaries. Just a fundamental mistake, and it's completely at odds with realism. Trump told us that he was going to settle the Ukrainian conflict in one day. And there is no evidence that we are even close to settling the Ukraine conflict. And if anything, we're heading in the other direction. So he has failed so far. Now, of course, he's only been in office for 3 weeks, but there is no evidence that he has a plan for shutting this war down. And it looks like the war is going to go on. And it looks like he is doing everything he can to dump this war into the lap of the Europeans. And it looks like the Europeans are coming to recognize that they don't have any choice but to accept much more of the burden of dealing with this war. So this is bad news all around. Bad news for the Ukrainian people, bad news for the Russians, bad news for the United States, bad news for the West, because we're not going to shut this one down anytime soon.
If it isn't realism, what is it? Is it mercantilism? Is it, I've seen people calling it national capitalism. Is it something new entirely?
I don't know. It's just, Trump sowing chaos. It's hard to say. As I've said, a few times here, I'm not exactly sure what Trump is up to. It doesn't make sense to me to say, after all of the attention the United States has paid to the Ukraine war, after all the support that the United States has given to Ukraine, to all of a sudden turn around and say, if you don't give us a huge chunk of your mineral wealth, we're going to abandon you. But if you don't, right, if you do give us all of this mineral wealth, we won't abandon you. We'll continue to support the war. That's what he's saying. That's certainly not a realist perspective, certainly not a morally correct perspective. And it raises the question, what is he doing here? Why do this? And I don't have a good answer.
Well, I mean, it might be answered by looking at his relationship to Russia, or his approach to Russia, his approach to Putin and the Kremlin. He has appeared to be a realist when it comes to Russia's interests, or understanding Russia's interests in the past. Russia in recent days has released an American hostage. I think it's going to, a prisoner, I should say. I think it's going to release another. Something's going on there, is it not? What can we interpret about that?
What's going on? I mean, I want to know what the plan is. The Russians have made it very clear what they want. And the question is, what is Trump willing to do to accommodate the Russians? What's the plan? There's no evidence they have a plan. Uh, there's no evidence there are any meaningful contacts between the Russians and the Americans for purposes of shutting this war down. Uh, so I don't think that releasing some prisoner makes any difference at all. The question is, what is the deal? What does Trump think he can do to shut this war down? And there's no evidence that the administration has the foggiest idea how they can shut this war down. And instead, Trump has been saying outrageous things about the Russians that are, if anything, designed to erode trust between the Russians and the Americans. And there's not very much trust to begin with. But, he says that the Russians have suffered 1 million deaths, which is a ludicrous claim, that their economy is in shambles, which is another ludicrous claim. And he says that he's going to do Putin a favor by shutting this war down for him, that we're going to do Putin a favor. Do you think this is going to make Putin think that Trump is somebody he can trust? Of course not. And Putin doesn't trust the West much at all. And Trump is just making the problem worse. So there's no concrete proposal floating around. There are no viable ideas coming out of the administration on how to accommodate the Russians, who happen to be in the driver's seat on the battlefield. And instead, what you're getting are rather outlandish statements that, if anything, going to make it harder to get a deal rather than easier.
Well, lastly, John, because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time here, but I would like to ask you a bit about China, which we talked a little bit about at the beginning. You did. Anyway, is that I'd like to put it to you that the real strategic focus of the Trump administration, as we understand it so far, and even more so in this second term, it seems, is dealing with China, dealing with the rise of China, confronting the rise of China. And he has people like Elbridge Colby in his administration who are very concerned about that. And that, when you look at the Panama Canal, what he's talking about in the Panama Canal, that's very much a concern about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has now, the Panamanian leader has said he will get rid of the Belt and Road, I believe. If you look at Greenland, that's long been a strategic concern that China is, could break through in the Arctic Circle and so on. The real focus is China. And if we want to make any sense of Trump's foreign policy, we need to think about what it's thinking about China.
I mean, I think that there's no question that the United States should be riveted on China, and it should think about how best to smartly contain China. I think that being pinned down in the Middle East and being pinned down in Ukraine makes it difficult for the United States to focus its attention on dealing with China. And therefore, one hoped that Trump would come in and shut down the conflict in Gaza, shut down the conflict in Ukraine, and concentrate on fashioning a smart containment policy in East Asia. That has not happened. As I said, he is, if anything, making the situation in Gaza worse. And not doing much at all to get us out of the Middle East. And there's no evidence that he's going to put an end to the Ukraine war. So we're pinned down in these two places, which causes us all sorts of problems in East Asia. Furthermore, if you look at what's happened in East Asia since he's taken office, there are all sorts of articles beginning to appear that because of what he's done with USAID, our position in Southeast Asia, where we have long had problems fashioning alliances that can help us contain China, our situation there in Southeast Asia is getting worse. And given Trump's tendency to slap allies around, it's not clear to me that he's going to do a really good job fashioning a balancing coalition in East Asia against China. So I think the situation in East Asia is actually not looking good at all.
And actually, this time, lastly, I know I said lastly last time, but I would like to ask you by answering a sort of yes/no question. You don't have to answer at length if you don't want to. A lot of people talk about the Trump administration as reversing America's decline as a superpower. It sounds to me from what you're saying that you believe he could be accelerating its decline. Do you believe he's accelerating it or reversing it or checking it in some way?
Well, when I think about decline, Freddie, I think I think of it in terms of the balance of power. Uh, and I think about how powerful the United States is in material terms versus how powerful China and Russia are relative to the United States. Uh, and the reason that the United States has been declining in terms of its power over time is because China has been rising. So it's in terms of relative power that we have been declining. But in terms of absolute power, if you look at the state of the American economy is doing quite well. It's growing. Uh, and I believe that if you look at uh, the future, right, there's every reason to think that the US economy will do very well. But the question is, how well will the Chinese economy continue to do? And if the Chinese economy were to grow at a really significant rate in the years ahead, then there would be relative decline for the United States because relative to China, we would be declining, even though our economy would be growing every year. So I think American decline mainly has to do with the Chinese economy. Now, to take this a step further, and I think this is a very important point, when we talk about containing China and we talk about dealing with China from an American point of view, the focus is usually on containment and putting together a balancing coalition, which involves usually uh, a focus on military force. But there's another competition that's taking place, and that has to do with cutting edge technologies, things like AI, quantum computing, uh, super chips, and so forth and so on. And there is a wickedly intense competition taking place there. And that competition for high end technologies matters enormously for the balance of economic power, which, of course, for a good realist like me, is of great consequence. So I think moving forward, the key question is how well does China do with AI, for example, versus how well the United States does with AI, right? And this will tell you a great deal about American decline moving forward. Now, all of this is to say, just to go to the heart of your point or your question, I don't think that Trump is doing anything yet that is eroding America's absolute power, right? Or speeding up America's relative decline. What Trump is having great trouble with so far, and again, he's only been 3 weeks into his administration, is the diplomacy that comes along with military power. The United States has this enormous power. It's still the most powerful state on the planet. The question is, what does American diplomacy look like? How is America using all that power that it has to fashion or to influence events around the world that are in the American national interest? And that's where I have all sorts of doubts about what Trump is doing. And of course, I had all sorts of doubts about what Biden was doing before Trump. So I think that in terms of power, the United States is not in bad shape. Uh, I think it's in terms of how it uses that power that it gets itself into trouble. And that's what worries me about Trump.
Professor John Mearsheimer, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. It's always a great pleasure to have you on.